A soldier of many battles, this character has earned the reward of experience, but also suffered the cost of it. Having lost an arm and an eye, we see a nobleman who has adapted his strategies to fit both the strength of his weapons and that of his mind. Capable of employing different tactics and techniques, this warrior takes advantage of magic, fire, and ice to overwhelm his opponents and make them feel the burn of both frost and flame. I present to you the Frostflame Veteran. This is a strength-intelligence hybrid build made to have pure adaptation to every combat encounter in the game, and the capability of locking down enemies in a relentless and endless loop of pain. This is a build made for those players that only have one word in their vocabulary: attack. As always, we will review the stats of this build, the equipment that we use, and of course its applications within the game. Since there is a lot of ground to cover, I have created timestamps in the description of this video in order to make it easier to navigate the content and give you the opportunity to skip straight to the part that interests you the most. Let's get started. This is a PvE-focused build that works well in both solo and jolly cooperation. It combines the power of versatile strength weapons with the added advantage of intelligence scaling frostbite buildup. This build does not use any sorceries. You heard that correctly. This melee-oriented build does not use a single sorcery, and instead focuses on having multiple weapons, tactics, and Ashes of War ready and on demand in order to tackle every single type of encounter in the game. It also takes advantage of support incantations to increase its defensive power. Furthermore, this build is capable of taking advantage of the synergy between the Frostbite status effect and Fire type damage, combining them into an engine of constant debilitating applications of percentile-based damage. Using multiple weapons and Ashes of War, we can immobilize and harass most enemies in the game, with Frost into Frost into Frost. To reach this objective, we will be running the following stats. Start the game as a Vagabond. This class is the most efficient to reach the required stat block for this build, allowing us to make use of every rune level possible to its maximum potential. As the primary focus of this build is PvE, I have chosen to base it on rune level 150. Finally, this is the stats blocks that you want to end up with. 60 Vigor, 26 Mind, 11 Endurance, 50 Strength, 13 Dexterity, 50 Intelligence, 12 Faith, and 7 Arcane. There are many ways to reach these stats. Level up however you feel comfortable. That said, I recommend that you take the following path. As soon as you are in the lands between, the first thing to do is get your Vigor to 20. Survivability is more important than damage when you're just starting out a character. The second priority is to get some basic support for the character. This means Faith to 12. You will get access to some basic support incantations that will increase your defensive power against certain difficult scenarios and enemies. For your third priority, bring your strength to 30. This will help you use different kinds of weapons and get you some decent strength scaling for your damage. Now, it's time to bulk up, and your fourth priority is to bring Vigor to 40. This will allow you to survive comfortably through the mid-game, allowing you to focus on your other stats. The fifth priority is to get Mind to 20. Most of our damage in this build will be through Ashes of War, so it is a good idea to get this up once we have established our survivability. The sixth priority is to get Strength to 50. This will finish up your strength scaling, giving you maximum versatility on your weapon choice and some really good scaling for your strength weapons. The seventh priority is to top off Vigor at 60. This will put you at our required HP pool, granting you maximum security to withstand the hardest hitting attacks from the endgame enemies. Next up, we focus on utility, and we bring our mind all the way up to 26. We finish leveling up this stat in order to get some more FP and the ability to use more Ashes of War in our battle. It is also helpful with the frequency that we can use our utility incantation. For your ninth and final priority, bring Intelligence all the way to 50. This is the final stat we level up, and we take it from level 9 to the final level 50. In this build, Intelligence is mostly used for scaling on our cold affinity weapons as well as magic and cold Ashes of War. Since we don't need it for any requirements, we can focus on being a strength build up until we finish creating the character. So, why do we want these final stats? Allow me to explain. Vigor at 60 because I believe it is the perfect amount of health to survive the hardest hitting attacks of PvE. This will give us the total of 1900 base HP. It is the second cap for the stat. Going any higher really diminishes your returns, and honestly, I never go any lower. Mind at 26 because this build runs a lot of power Ashes of War, as well as some light support incantations. It provides us with a lot of damage, so I wanted to get this as high as possible after min-maxing every other stat in the build. Endurance at 11 because it is the base level of the Vagabond. Due to my choices of equipment, it is exactly what we need to have access to all of our weapons and armor while maintaining a medium load. It is min-maxed exactly. Leveling this up in this build is a waste of points. Strength at 50 because it is one of the primary stats of the build. It controls our weapon requirements as well as the damage from weapon scaling and Ashes of War. Dexterity at 13 because it is the base level of the Vagabond. It is already enough to meet all of the requirements that we need. Do not level this up any further. Intelligence at 50 because it is the other primary stat of the build. While we do not need it to meet any requirements, it is very useful for some efficient weapon scaling on our cold affinity armaments, as well as our magic and cold Ashes of War. Faith at 12 because it is the minimum that we need in order to take advantage of some key incantations that bring a lot of support to the build. The amount of benefit we get from this is very much worth the investment. Finally, Arcane at 7 because it is the base level of the Vagabond. We do not increase it at all in this build. Moving on to the equipment, this is the basic layout of the build. In order to represent the experience and different tactics of the character, I aim to provide the player with many different playstyles, all accessible quickly and efficiently with simple soft swaps. In the main hand, we run two weapons, a cold longsword and a fired claymore. These are the weapons that will determine your active damage type. The cold longsword is an extremely good weapon, presenting upper tier C scaling on both strength and intelligence. As a result, we have good damage and over 100 points of frost buildup per hit. This is on a weapon that has a fantastic moveset and a very fast attacking speed. With this weapon, I like to use the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War. Understanding that this Ash of War was heavily nerfed in one of the first patches that the game received, it still provides decent damage with fantastic crowd control capabilities. It is perfect to control space and to proc Frostbite on multiple targets before we charge in to finish the job. That said, there are other good Ash of War options, like for example Glintstone Phalanx or Carrion Grandeur. The longsword is one of my favorite weapons in the game, and it never disappoints. Also in our main hand we want the Fire Claymore. Another extremely versatile weapon, this Claymore gives us a fantastic moveset with very good fire split damage. The main objective with this weapon is to provide the build with a secondary damage type. In this case, the Fire Claymore will allow this build to perform perfectly against any kind of enemies that are resistant to magic damage. It is also one of the key parts required in order to execute the main combo of the build. All in all, it is a very versatile weapon that will give you answers to most issues the game presents you. For its Ash of War, I like to use Lion's Claw. This is one of the best Ashes of War in the game, providing high damage, high poise, and a knockdown. It is perfect to deal damage and also to set up immediate damage after using it. That being said, other good Ashes of War to use with this weapon are Giant Hunt or Flames of the Redmane. It is the combination of utility, versatility, and multiple damage types that makes both of these weapons a tried and true engine of success. In the offhand, for this build, I like to run a cold longsword, the Twin Bird Kite Shield, and the Frenzied Flame Seal. If the main hand of this build determines which will be our main damage type, then the offhand determines what will be our playstyle. Starting with the cold longsword, this weapon in our offhand gives us the opportunity to dual wield two cold longswords for maximum frostbite buildup. With this setup, we are able to proc Frostbite status on most enemies with about 4 hits, which is just 2 dual wield attacks. This is definitely the most offensive setup and our main source of damage. If the enemy does not resist magic damage or the Frostbite status effect, they will go down very quickly. For the Ash of War, I choose to use Gravitas for this weapon. One of the most annoying things for this build is being attacked by flying enemies. For this reason, I keep Gravitas in my offhand and only use it when I need to force flying threats into the ground. The second armament in the offhand is the Twin Bird Kite Shield. I picked this shield mostly because of its looks and how good it fits the fashion that I use on this character. In reality, any shield with a 100% physical block defense and good guard boost works just as well. The reason why I like to keep this shield in my offhand is because there are certain enemies that are just easier to defeat with a shield, and I want to keep this option open. Quick enemies such as dogs or catacomb imps are much easier to get rid of if you bait them to attack your shield and then counter when they recoil. I don't have it out very often, but I am always happy to have it ready for when the situation arises. As for the Ash of War on the shield, I prefer no skill. I am more interested in having the Ash of War of my main weapon easily accessible, and I have no interest in parry. The final armament in our offhand is the Frenzied Flame Seal. This seal is perfect for this build because it has no stat requirements and no weight. This means that we can use it to cast our basic support incantations without having to worry about incantation scaling or increasing our equip burden. Having access to specific incantations to increase our defenses and deal with very specific problems is very useful, and have it immediately accessible without it affecting our weight ratios is extremely powerful. With this build, we can use a fast dual wield style, we can use a powerful greatsword style, and we can use a defensive sword and board style, and they are all easily accessible through soft swaps upon request. This armament setup gives this build all of the answers that it needs. With our weapons out of the way, let's talk about Talismans. This build has a very simple objective when it comes to Talisman. As a fully offensive melee build, we need to deal the most damage possible, but we also want to be able to take a hit to survive difficult situations. For this reason, we are running the Erdtree Favor +2, the Crimson Amber Medallion +2, and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to be able to maximize our defensive potential. These three talismans gives us a total of 2,134 HP, with a very reliable 30% physical damage absorption. With our defensive power taken care of, we rely on the Shard of Alexander to increase our largest sources of damage. This build runs a lot of different Ashes of War that serve different purposes. Some of these ashes are very good at crowd control, while others go in hard on damage. Having an additional 15% damage on all of these options is too good to ignore. As you can see, this setup protects the build when it moves in, and it provides the damage needed to speed up all encounters. Now, in order to make this guide as complete as possible, I find myself with the obligation of offering you an alternative. With this alternative, you will be dealing a higher amount of damage, but you will also be in danger of dying much more quickly. The change is simple. First, you exchange the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia. Second, you need to remove the Twin Bird Kite Shield in order to make space in our equip load and keep a medium dodge roll. This will still let us keep our 2,134 HP, and we will also have our additional 15% damage on Ashes of War. That said, we lose a lot of physical absorption, going from 30% to just 13%. In exchange, we get additional damage the more we attack. More attack means more damage, and our attack rating will increase by 6%, 8%, and 13% in different tiers, based on how many attacks we hit. This is a lot of damage, especially combined with the Frostbite status effect that we proc, but it does make the build very squishy. Be careful if you choose this route, it is definitely risky. Alright, let's talk about armor. In this game, armor is extremely important. This is because this game has extremely good looking armor. Fashion Souls, or Elden Ring, however you prefer to call it, is at an all-time high. For this build, I was unsure what to do, and began to look through some of the armor pieces that I had. I was fortunate to find this setup after some trial and error. The full fashion is made up of the Altered Commoner's Headband, the Altered Alvarez Robe, Melania's Gauntlet, and the Carian Knight Greaves. I enjoyed this look a lot, and it reminded me of a war-torn noble. As things are, this is one of my favorite fashion sets in the game. This combination provides a fantastic visual to the build's identity, and honestly, I could not be more pleased with it. In any case, this armor set provides 13% physical damage reduction on its own that turns into 30% physical damage reduction with the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. As for poise, this fashion only provides 10 points of it. Obviously, we will not be tanking any hits while wearing this armor. I definitely went for looks over stats with this setup. Next up, I want to go over the summon that can prove to be useful in this build. For this build, I truly believe that the best spirit summon is the Mimic. Not only does it provide a good distraction with a lot of HP, but the fact that it copies our equipment makes it so there are a total of 4 cold longswords on the board, applying frost to all enemies. This is also very useful against bosses. While the Mimic applies Frostbite, you can run the Fire Claymore in order to remove the status while the Mimic continues to apply it. Of course, I also like to keep sleeping pots in my item belt so that the Mimic can take advantage of them. Being the only item in the belt, the Mimic will use it generously, placing enemies to sleep left and right. Between this and the Frostbite, the summon turns into an incredible machine of crowd control efficiency. With this support, you are able to position yourself in the best situations to keep the attacks going very aggressively. The Mimic also uses the Ashes of War in the weapons that it has access to. It will always prioritize the main hand weapon, so you will see a lot of Hoarfrost Stomp and Lion's Claw, depending on whether you summon it with the Longsword or the Claymore active. That said, it will also make use of the offhand weapon at times too. If you summoned it with the Longsword in the offhand, expect a Gravitas here and there for crowd control, and if you summoned it with the shield, you just created a much more defensive tank-type Mimic to support you. As you can see, depending on which weapons you have active when you summon this spirit, you can dictate the general support that it will bring. Just like we can adapt to different situations with our equipment, we can also set up the Mimic to provide different types of support, depending on our situation. This creates incredible synergy, filled with adaptability and versatility, a true asset to our offense. In this build, I focused on having many options active and within reach almost immediately. Multiple weapons ready to be soft swapped to, that can provide changes in playstyle and tools to deal with all situations that the game can present us. Part of this versatility and capability of adaptation comes from our choice of weapons. It is also very important to highlight how primordial our choice of Ashes of War is. The Ashes of War provides tools for damage, for crowd control, and even answers to specific problems that could give the build trouble. Everything comes together in order to give this character every advantage possible. Just like with spells, Ashes of War is a personal choice. Do not hesitate to use whatever is most fun for you. For now, let's take a look at my personal choices and the reasons why I use them. Like we explained in the Armaments section, the main Ashes of War that I like to use are Hoarfrost Stomp on my main Longsword, Lion's Claw on my Fire Claymore, and Gravitas on my offhand Longsword. Each of these serves a specific purpose in order to increase the power of the build. All the way back in February, when Elden Ring was just released, this Ash of War was absolutely overtuned, to the point that it made the game incredibly easy. It dealt a lot of damage on top of the fact that it cost Frostbite for even more damage. It was nerfed in a patch, it severely lowered the amount of damage it dealt, and as such, this lowered its efficiency. That being said, I have found that this Ash of War is perfect for crowd control and battlefield manipulation. First of all, it has incredible range for a close quarter Ash of War. Second, the cone shape AoE is fantastic for catching multiple enemies and grouping them together. And third, it generates Frostbite buildup. Generally speaking, it will proc the Frostbite status effect on most enemies with just 2 uses. All of this is fantastic, but the main reason that I like to use this Ash of War is the ability that it has to lock down enemies. This Ash of War has 2 points of contact, meaning that there are 2 instances when the enemies are hit by an attack. First, enemies receive a hit when they first come into contact with the cone AoE, and then they receive a second hit when the frost spikes burst. Why is this so important? Well, enemies being hit twice means that they recoil on 2 occasions. This pins the enemies down in place, slowing down their movements. Enemies that are hit recoil, and enemies blocking are severely slowed down. Since this happens twice, this gives us a lot of time to attack the enemies while they are locked down. Furthermore, if the Hoarfrost Stomp procs Frostbite on the enemies, they will stagger for a bit longer, generating even more time and advantage for the player. All in all, we can agree that this Ash of War is not what it used to be. it is obvious that it does not inflict a ton of damage. That said, for this build that is constantly on the attack, its abilities to lock down enemies and crowd control them provides a ton of value for our offense. On my Fire Claymore, I prefer to use Lion's Claw. This is one of my favorite Ashes of War. It deals a lot of damage and has an almost infinite amount of poise. I sat down to think if there was any moment where an enemy interrupted me when using Lion's Claw, and I honestly cannot remember it. I certainly have no footage of it either. Because of this damage and poise security, I consider Lion's Claw to be one of the best offensive Ashes of War in the game. Furthermore, unless we are talking about large bosses, hitting an enemy with this attack will knock them down into the ground. This will force the enemy to have to get back up, which sounds obvious, but it does provide some fantastic opportunities to set up for more damage while they're doing so. This Ash of War is a key component of this build's main strategy, and it is a fantastic engine to have Frostbite status effect procced multiple times on the same enemy. On my offhand cold longsword, I like to run the Gravitas Ash of War. I will be honest, Gravitas is the type of Ash of War that this build does not use often, but it always comes in clutch when we need it. On its own, it is a good Ash of War that provides a good bit of crowd control. That said, the number one reason why I keep this in my back pocket is the amazing answer that it provides against flying enemies. Generally speaking, flying enemies are annoying, and specifically, they are a big threat for this build. In order to neutralize this threat, we use Gravitas. When activated, this Ash of War creates a force field with considerable range that pulls enemies towards the caster. If the enemy happens to be flying, they will be flung into the ground, staggered and completely stunned for a few seconds. This gives us enough time to kill it before it takes to the air again. This is the answer to every flying enemy threat. From those dragonflies that are not dangerous but extremely annoying, all the way up to the killer falcons from Castle Sol. If it flies, Gravitas comes out. After going over the Ashes of War that I personally prefer to use, I want to once again highlight the fact that you can use any others that you think are better or more fun. At the end of the day, this is a personal choice. With this said, there are some Ashes of War that, while I may not use as often, I still keep them in mind. I want to give honorable mentions to Giant Hunt, Glintstone Phalanx, Flame of the Revenants, and Carrion Grandeur. Each of these offer their own advantages that may suit your playstyle. Giant Hunt is great for raw damage and setting up additional damage later on. Glintstone Phalanx generates an incredible amount of stability damage that can stance break enemies very easily. Flame of the Revenants is also a stance breaking machine, and additionally, it is a fantastic fire-type crowd control to deal with multiple enemies at once. Finally, Carrion Grandeur is the Ash of War with the highest damage potential. With damage in the thousands and a large range, this Ash is perfect for those that want a big hit on demand. Furthermore, its range makes it go through walls very easily, a trick that is useful when one knows how to use it. Whatever you choose, it is important that you're comfortable using the techniques and that you try to cover as many bases as possible in order to generate versatility for the build. The more variation that you have, the stronger your character will become. Like we went over when we talked about the stats, this build runs a simple 12 points of faith in order to take advantage of some basic support incantations that go a long way in making this build much stronger. For this, there are two important things to keep in mind. First, spell choice is personal. I will be showing you the list that I like to use with this build, but be sure to make the additions or changes that you feel are needed for your experience. Second, there is a lot of power that we can get from just 12 faith. A lot of incantations have low requirements and they provide a lot of support to old builds. If you are interested in knowing just how much power we can get from 12 faith, I will leave a link in the description to another guide that explains this subject matter. Do not hesitate to check it out. With nothing further to add, let me show you the incantations that I like to use. There are 6 spells that I always run, no matter what, on a character with just 12 faith. The list is as follows: Flame Cleanse Me, Magic Fortification, Flame Fortification, lightning fortification, divine fortification, and heal. First is Flame Cleanse Me. This is one of the most powerful incantations in the game. It provides a fast, cheap way to get rid of poison and, most importantly, Scarlet Rot. This should always be in your list of spells. At only 12 faith requirement, it is too good to pass up, and there is no reason to not use it in every build that you make. Second, we have the Resistance Crew. The quartet of Magic Fortification, Flame Fortification, Lightning Fortification, and Divine Fortification is our main tool to counterpick the damage that each of the game's enemies and bosses will do. They provide resistance to magic, fire, lightning, and holy damage respectively. You should always have one of these active if you want to increase your chances of survival. Each of these incantations will leave you with around 48 to 50% absorption of the chosen type, depending on what kind of armor you choose to use. Mileage may vary, but it is a good choice to have these on. It is very important to know what you're up against so that you can help yourself survive the battle. Finally, Heal. This incantation is the only healing spell that I use. That said, due to the low incantation scaling of our seal, it does not really heal very well. Fortunately, we do not need to use this spell to recover health. In fact, I use this spell for one thing, and one thing only: to kill Revenants. Revenants are one of the most powerful and annoying non-boss type enemies that you can find in the game. They deal incredible amounts of damage and are in constant motion and attack. They teleport around the area and, I am sure you know, have that one move where they hit you 1,000,000 times with all of their limbs in succession. It is very difficult to fight them, but fortunately, if you do not let them get started on their offense, then they become much easier. In order to achieve this, we use Heal. Revenants are very weak to holy damage, but also they are extremely weak to healing spells. If you cast a healing spell with an AoE and it catches the Revenant, they will take damage instead of being healed. The amount of damage they take is always the same, about 60% of their total HP. 2 spells will always kill them, and since this first spell also staggers them, it is very easy to cast 2 of them back to back for the kill. Since the damage is always the same, I like to use Heal, because it costs the least FP of all the AoE heals. If you execute this strategy correctly, then you will defeat the Revenant before it even has a chance to hit you. I have mentioned it in other sections of the video, but the time has come to go over in detail what I call the Frostflame Combo. Let's start with the theory. The Frostflame Combo starts with the Frostbite status effect. When an enemy is inflicted with this status effect, they immediately take damage equal to 30 HP, plus an additional 10% of their total HP. If they are a boss, they immediately take damage equal to 30 HP, plus an additional 5% of their total HP. They also receive a 30-second debuff that increases all further damage that they take by 20%. Finally, the Frostbite status effect decreases stamina regeneration for 30 seconds, but this is mostly relevant against other players. These are the effects of Frostbite. Now, this effect ends when it wears out after 30 seconds, or if the afflicted enemy takes fire damage. This last bit is the important one. If the afflicted enemy takes fire damage. With this information, we can inflict Frostbite on a boss, let's say Malenia, dealing 5% of her total HP and damage, and then we can deal fire damage to her to remove the condition, only to attack her again and inflict Frostbite a second time, dealing yet another 5% of her total HP in damage. The result is simple, yet effective. Not only does she take a full 10% total HP worth of damage, but she also takes all the additional damage from the attacks she received. This adds up and generates an incredible offense. Now that we know how it works, let's talk about how we can make it work. How can we successfully execute this technique as often as possible? For this, we need a combo. Honestly, it is more so a chain of attacks rather than a combo, so you can create your own combinations to work with. That said, this is what I do with this build. The first part is to start the series by attacking the enemy until you proc Frostbite. With dual-wield cold longswords, this should not take many hits. Once you proc Frostbite on your enemy, this will cause them to flinch and stagger. This is the opportunity to immediately switch to the Claymore and attack the enemy with Lion's Claw. Since this is a Fire Claymore, Lion's Claw will deal Fire Split damage. This will remove the frostbite we just afflicted to the enemy and it will knock them down into the ground. Next up, while the enemy is getting up, we switch back to the Cold Longsword and attack them in order to inflict frostbite again, reapplying all damage and effects. This combo allows us to attack the enemy for massive damage through 2 full applications of frostbite, on top of the normal weapon damage that we deal. As you can see, if done correctly, we get all of this damage and the enemy has very little opportunity to react, thanks to getting staggered from the frostbite applications and getting knocked down into the ground. This is a fantastic technique that this build can use very often with a very efficient FP cost. It is perfect for locking down and eliminating difficult targets that may otherwise be a hassle to deal with. That said, applying and reapplying frostbite may not always be the best decision. Sure, it is powerful, but it is also important to understand what we lose when doing this combo. I will repeat myself. The Frostflame Combo is very powerful. Capable of inflicting percentile-based damage on a single enemy multiple times, it is impossible to ignore how effective it is at eliminating targets. With that said, just because it is powerful, it does not mean that it should be always used on every single enemy. Remember that, with the combo, we remove the frostbite effect from the enemy, which means that it also removes the debuff that forces them to take an additional 20% damage. So now, we need to understand what is better on each situation. Should we go for the combo, reapply frostbite multiple times and take the fixed percentile damage, or should we keep the debuff on and take advantage of the additional 20% damage on all attacks? In my opinion, you should always use this combo on high-profile enemies when playing solo. Bosses, mini-bosses, and difficult enemies like omens, trolls, or others with high HP. On the other hand, in situations where I am fighting multiple enemies, I prefer to take advantage of the additional 20% damage while I do some crowd control. In the same way, if I am playing co-op, I also prefer to take advantage of the 20% additional damage from the frostbite effect, because the other players that are with me might be dealing more damage than me, and a 20% increase is very considerable. It is important to understand the strength of the combo and the different consequences of using it. Sometimes it is better to do it, while other times it is not. The more you know about the game, and the more you play, the easier it will be for you to make this decision. This build is strong, very strong. It is capable of very high amounts of damage through constant and relentless attacks. It can decimate enemies in seconds. Also, it has a ton of options and answers to almost all situations that the game can throw at you. That being said, I have to admit that it is not easy to play with this build. Having a relentless offense means that you are always in the way of harm. Getting hit is a real danger, and if you're not careful, you can get comboed by multiple enemies, spelling your death. Learning and knowing how to crowd control, as well as picking the right answer for each situation, is very important. This is something that comes with experience, and as always, the more you know, the more powerful you will become. This build has a learning curve, but do not let that discourage you from unlocking its true potential. It is a massive monster of destruction. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope I get to see you on the next one.